Good afternoon and welcome to the virtual launch of the 15th World Bank Uganda Economic Update. I do apologize for the time. We have overshot a little bit, but we will get started immediately. My name is Josephine Karunji and I'll be hosting this discussion. Every year, the World Bank gives us a picture of issues that affect you and I. So things like the state of education, health, social protection, and so on. This year, though, we will discuss a report commissioned by the World Bank on the effect of COVID-19 on Uganda's economic outlook and digital solutions in the time of crisis. The hashtag is DigitizeUG. Before we begin the presentations and discussions, let's have opening remarks from Mr. Tony Thompson, the World Bank Country Manager, Uganda. Tony?
Very good. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the World Bank's 15th Economic Update on Uganda. My name is Tony Thompson, and I'm the World Bank's Country Manager for Uganda. I'm delighted that you've all joined us this afternoon. Let me give a special thanks to NTV, our moderator, Josephine Karunji, and our distinguished panelists. We produce an economic update for Uganda about twice a year. We issued our last update in February, so this is the first time that we are providing an assessment since the COVID-19 pandemic hit earlier this year. Today's launch should answer two important questions. First, how is COVID-19 affecting Uganda's economy, and what are the prospects for recovery? And second, as many people around the world are turning over to digital services such as shopping, mobile money, government e-services and so on, what's happening in Uganda's digital economy and what is its potential to contribute to the recovery? On my Twitter feed, I get a lot of comments ranging from energetically positive to sharply critical. We at World Bank are fully committed to engaging in open, candid dialogue. So let me encourage all of you who are watching to use this opportunity to engage with us and with the panelists. Send us your questions, send in your comments so we can have a good discussion and debate. Many thanks, and back to you, Josephine.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. Now, we have quite a bit to go through, so I'll quickly invite Mr. Richard Walker, a senior economist with the World Bank, to present the report on the state of the economy. Richard, over to you.
Thanks very much. Today the presentation will be in two parts. Firstly, the state of the economy. Second part will be on digital solutions in a time of crisis. The presentation on the state of the economy is just to give some highlights from the report. Just as some background, firstly just to touch on the COVID-19 crisis. It's a major global health pandemic. You can see on the chart there, global cases are already above 10 million. And concerning for this region is that cases in Africa are starting to accelerate. As a result of the pandemic and the substantial mobility restrictions that have gone with this, you find this massive halt in global economic activity. So the chart on the left there shows the global trade contraction of about almost 15% expected in this calendar year, 2020. Chart on the right shows how global travel has slumped in 2020. The line at the bottom, the red line, showing a number of total daily flights in 2020 compared to the 3 previous years. You can see that sharp dip in March, and it still hasn't recovered. As a result of this, the first message is that COVID-19 has devastated the global economy. Global growth in 2020 is expected to drop by more than 5%. You also see the chart in the right. This shows the number of economies in recession. More than 90% of economies in the world are in recession right now, which is the highest over the last 150 years, even compared to periods such as the Great Depression in the late 20s, 30s, World War II, and the global financial crisis. Uganda has been impacted through a number of channels. Just a quick highlight here has been the chart on the left. The black dashed line shows the drop in exports from about almost 20% of GDP in the fiscal year 19 to about 13% in fiscal year 20. Tourism was also dropped significantly, with revenues falling from over $1 billion in FY19 to about $500 million in FY20, and expected to fall even further this fiscal year 21, and the outlook going forward is uncertain. In terms of remittances, again, also crashed from about 4% of GDP to an expected, in this next fiscal year, about 2% of GDP. Foreign investment has also fallen from more than $2 billion, almost $2 billion to just under $1 billion. The expectation, though, on foreign investment is that it will increase quicker and recover over time due to continued interest in the oil sector and manufacturing activities. The chart on the right shows the decline in private consumption. As people have lost jobs, as they've lost incomes, you see this slowdown in the economy with growth in private consumption falling from about 8% to about 1%.
To your presentation, I have a question here, and people are asking, is this report going to be shared with the public, and how soon will that be?
Yeah, it will be shared with the public, and it should be out by tomorrow.
It should be out by tomorrow?
Yeah. The full report will be out.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. We're also, as Richard gives that presentation, we're waiting for some of our guests who are yet to come, and we will be talking about that panel. Some of our panelists, we're waiting for Mr. Keith Mwakanizi, the Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, and Dr. Adam Mugume, Acting Deputy Governor with the Bank of Uganda. They should be able to join us soon enough for us to then speak about the report that Richard is sharing with us from the World Bank. Go through the report even without the pictures showing on the screen.
Okay, sure. I mean, I think the second message really is that growth is expected to collapse over the next this fiscal year and going into the next fiscal year, falling from about 6.5% last year to about 3% this year, and potentially even further next fiscal year. But there's a lot of uncertainties involved. If you're looking at a calendar year, growth is expected. This is the calendar year 2020. Growth is expected to be between about 0.5% and 1.5% roughly, which is a significant drop from calendar year 2019 when it was about 5.6%. So just looking at the third message in our report that I'll present today is government has responded quickly to this crisis. You see an uptick in current spending as a percentage of GDP. This has really gone into strengthening health systems, emergency funds. It's gone into financial support for water and electricity providers. It's gone to recapitalization of Uganda Development Bank, and it's also gone into increased domestic arrears payments to the private sector. At the same time, unfortunately, there's been this drop in tax revenues due to the contraction in trade, contraction in economic activity. Also, some of the measures to support the economy, tax exemptions and deferrals, have led to this drop in tax revenues. And as you see here, the orange column is the outcome expected for the last fiscal year that's just finished in June, which is about 2% roughly of GDP less than what was budgeted for the fiscal year 20, which is a significant drop, and also obviously constrains the space for government to provide services in the economy. As I say, the government's responded quickly, but there are some challenges. The first one, certainly there's this need to raise more tax revenues. This is discussed in the report, and what you see over the next few years, these three blue columns to the right, is that the expectation is revenues will be about 11, 12, 13% of GDP, which is really, it's really insufficient for the needs in the country at the moment, and also falls very well short of the domestic revenue mobilization strategy, which has set a target of 16 to 18% of GDP by fiscal year 24. Next challenge is to really execute the development budget or the capital expenditure of the government. You can see on this chart in the middle here how the expectation is about 8-9% of GDP expenditure over the next 3 fiscal years, which is, again, as an example, is well below what was even budgeted last fiscal year of about 11.8% of GDP. And this is concerning also given that there's been a raft of reforms of institutional capacity building yet we still see these low levels. And it's something that needs a concerted effort to ensure that public investments are made effectively to drive the economic growth. And then thirdly, there'll be this need to manage the ballooning fiscal deficit. You can see from about 5% in fiscal year 19, the increase through 7%, 7.5%, up to almost 9% expected this fiscal year, which is a lot higher than what has been targeted in the Charter for Fiscal Responsibility of about 3% by FY21. So in time, this ballooning fiscal deficit will have to come down, which will obviously mean constraints for the fiscal space for the government. Along with the ballooning fiscal deficit, you find obviously an expansion in public debt. This chart shows what's happened over the last 5 years. Reached a point where Uganda's public debt is expected to be about 45% of GDP in nominal terms at the end of June last fiscal year. However, before I talk about some of the vulnerabilities, just to say that Uganda still remains at low risk of debt distress on the recent IMF World Bank debt sustainability assessment. And this is largely because about 70% of external borrowing is through multilateral financing on concessional terms. And what you see in the chart, that blue arrow, shows the majority of debt taken on over the last year has been from external sources, this kind of financing. However, there are these vulnerabilities. You find that debt has had a steep upward trajectory over the last 5 years, and then expected to exceed 50% of GDP in nominal terms, and then move towards 60% of GDP by FY23. And this is exceeding a threshold, this 50% in nominal terms that the government had said would not be exceeded. There's also risks to debt sustainability, slower growth. There's obviously the COVID crisis is ongoing. We're moving into an election period. Furthermore, there may be required additional spending to manage the crisis, which may require additional debt. And then again, there's been delays in the final investment decision in the oil sector, and this has implications for being able to service the debt with oil revenues. And finally, a concern is that debt servicing is already high for Uganda, and that more than 50% of what's collected in local taxes and revenues is just going to servicing loans, which creates the concern about liquidity risks and being able to service this debt going forward. And a final challenge that we just want to highlight from the report is this need to enhance the coverage and design of shock-responsive social safety nets. You find that the poverty rate as a result of COVID-19 is expected to increase. This could mean about 1 to 3 million additional poor Ugandans relative to the figure of close to 9 million in FY17. As a result, these households are going to need urgent support if they are to emerge from the crisis in a position that they can contribute to and benefit from the economy, and not to be set too far back. On the other hand, you find that Uganda has been underinvesting in the future productivity and resilience of its people, and some studies have shown that a child born in Uganda today will only be 38% as productive when she grows up as she could have been if she had received full education and full health. You compare this to Zimbabwe, which is about 44%, and Kenya, which is about 52%. It just shows the challenges remaining in building human capital in Uganda. In a crisis, though, it's important to at least protect and sustain whatever human capital there is, and safeguard the future productivity of all Ugandans. And my final message on state of the economy is just around the outlook. Unfortunately, it's not favorable. I've already mentioned that growth is set to range between about just above 2.5% to just above 3.5% of GDP this next fiscal year. The wider range is obviously due to increased uncertainties in the year and unknowns about what's going to happen, which I'll talk to now. Inflation is expected to be relatively benign. As you saw on the chart earlier, exports are likely to start picking up again, but not necessarily quickly. And you also find that FDI as well pick up initially slowly, and we're looking forward, or we expect a stronger pickup as we may get closer towards the date of of oil production in Uganda. As I mentioned, also the fiscal deficit is likely to continue ballooning, which will mean an increase in the size of public debt as a percentage of GDP. But as I say on the top there, the risks loom large. The first one obviously being the COVID crisis. Not sure exactly how this pandemic is going to play out, what it will mean for the new global economy, what it will mean in Uganda, in the region. It's a certain risk to the whole outlook. Many people have said this crisis is actually a crisis within a crisis. There has been the locust threat, which still exists. There are also often weather-related shocks in Uganda. We've just recently had the heavy rains and floods, which again are risks to the outlook. We are moving into an election cycle, which obviously brings with some uncertainty around the outlook and over the next year. I've talked quite a bit about the public debt situation. Here I put a green circle around this icon for debt, and I think that's just to remind everyone that Uganda is still in a sustainable position in terms of its public debt, and that it's important to maintain that and work hard to keep it in that position. There's some risks externally in the region in terms of potential further trade shocks, what will happen with global financial markets as the COVID pandemic plays out, when will remittances start to recover. These are a lot of uncertainties at the moment, which we just need to monitor and see how that plays out. There's also the oil price. The chart on the bottom left there shows how the price has dropped significantly this year, down to close to $20 to the barrel, and has picked up now somewhat to $40 to a barrel, but is still significantly below what is estimated to be the break-even price of production in Uganda of about $60 to the barrel. Through all of this, though, there has been some green shoots. There have been some businesses that have found new ways of doing things. We as people have found new ways of living our lives. And a lot of this has been as a result of digital solutions and digital technologies. And that's where later this afternoon, my colleague Kosam, who's coming in from Washington, she'll present on digital solutions in a time of crisis.
All right, thank you very much, Richard, for that very elaborate report. I know that it's a lot more than you could fix in the 10 minutes that we gave you to do, but I'd like you to come and join us on the panel. One of our teams in here will lead you to the panel. But as we have you come in to sit with us, I'll introduce the rest of our panelists. I'll start with Dr. Adam Mugume, the Acting Deputy Governor, Bank of Uganda. He's also the Executive Director, Economic Research at Bank of Uganda. He has published extensively on macroeconomics and statistical issues. Thank you so much for joining us. I believe the traffic was quite a bit of a problem. All right, and also we have Mr. Matthias Katamba, Chief Executive of DFCU Bank. He is the current chairman of Uganda Bankers Association and outgoing chairman of Uganda Institute of Banking and Financial Services. He has a banking career spanning 2 decades, having previously held various managerial positions in Housing Finance Bank. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have all of you. We were expecting Mr. Keith Mwakanizi, the Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. Unfortunately, he's not yet here, but we'll start anyway with or without him. Now, we all know that Uganda was hit by the global pandemic COVID-19. We have seen many infections, but thankfully, severity has been much less than many other countries. A lockdown was put in place to mitigate the threat. If we judge the effectiveness of these measures by the outcome in terms of casualties to COVID-19, we might say the response is appropriate. Unfortunately, life is more complicated. The measures themselves have had significant impacts beyond the pandemic. Because of these measures, here and elsewhere, economies are teetering on the brink of collapse. Health, social and educational needs have been stifled and may have untold consequences yet. Now, some well-to-do countries sent checks to their citizens to cushion the hard times. Others sent food, same as what Uganda has done. Countries basically did what they could. Could Uganda have done more? And that is my first question to my panelists. Could Uganda have done more? Whoever wants to go first, welcome to that.
Thank you, Josephine. Maybe I'll go first. I think one needs to pick this from right where you mentioned in those remarks. I think first, the health crisis has been managed well. I think first we had public health crisis, of course, followed by an economic challenge, but the public health crisis has been managed well. I think from the fact that the response to the pandemic, those who fell sick were responded to, treated, recovered. The lockdowns were swift, they were quick, they were effective, and they prevented immediate spread. All the aspects done, in transport, etc., all that was done, and the gradual easing that is happening now. So I think one can say that in comparison to a number of other countries, on that respect, Uganda has done well. I think the economic crisis following the pandemic will evolve, and this needs to be judged over time. There's a limit to the response of the government. Of course, in light of the nature of the resources you've just seen from the report, revenue collection, etc. But I think one has to give credit on the side of the management of the health crisis, and we hope that this continues. As you will have seen, the management at the borders, the testing, and all these aspects. So one has to give credit, and to give credit to the people who've been working at the front line to see that the immediate response has been robust.
All right. Dr. Mugemed, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think I fully agree that Uganda has really done well. Let us be sincere in terms of managing the, the spread of the pandemic, and also have the history. Remember the Ebola crisis, and even to a great extent AIDS. So Uganda has really managed very well in some of those cases. Now the question comes is, we can sit here now and make debate on whether food stamps or whether we would have used the digital payment system to send checks rather than for posho and beans, etc. Because now, sort of we are into the crisis or towards the end of the crisis. But I remember when this thing was evolving, it is a shock we don't anticipate it. And everybody was thought that probably within 1 month would dissipate. But now it has been going on with, it has been with us for longer. Probably now, that's when we talk about debate whether probably sending digital money rather than food would be better. But I think when it was starting, the assumption was, within 1 month, the thing will evaporate, well handled, etc. And that's also what was coming in through the global world. So overall, in terms of judging where, the way we have handled it, on health terms, has been excellent. Whether it would have been better in terms of supporting, in terms of the vulnerable groups, giving them money rather than food, we can now debate it now and run it going forward. That probably in another shock, probably rather than buying posho or beans, or rather give them money through the mobile money. But so far, I think to the extent that some people, nobody died of hunger. Yes, poverty has increased, as the presenter was saying. There's no doubt about that. But I think overall we can say, we have managed it well.
I do agree that we're walking in the unknown when COVID-19 started, even with the fact that a lot of other countries had gone through it. But we can't speak as yet to say nobody has died of hunger, because a lot of reports will not be known until this whole situation, has come down. But can we talk of a more balanced approach to dealing with COVID-19, a way that will not destroy what is left of the economy, let alone salvaging the damage to education, health, and other aspects of society? Yes, Matthias.
Well, so I think one has to feel a bit for public officials managing under these circumstances, because it's a very delicate balancing act. On the one hand, following the science, on the other, following the trends across the globe. We've seen what's happened in economies that have been opening up gradually. We now have examples of where it's been positive and where challenges have happened. You've seen in the US the re-emergence of high levels of infections, and some reports saying the peak is going to come again in the next month or two in the US, back to the period sort of where we were before. So I think that officials in public administration are balancing
the impact of keeping certain sectors closed vis-a-vis the public health challenge. However, on the other hand, while striking that balance, it's important to put into perspective the potential crisis that can emerge out of a largely informal society not being able to have continuity from a trade point of view. Many businesses have the kind of capital that will probably not go beyond 4 or 5 months if trading doesn't continue. But we've seen a high level of resilience in micro businesses and the ability of these micro businesses to vary business models. I mean, if you're working in Chikubo and your shop is not open and you can trade in Nansana online and have your customers reach you on phone. So there's all this ingenuity going on, but certainly it will be useful for for those in public administration to see how such businesses can be supported and what kind of incentives can be given to allow that continuity without compromising the public health issue.
All right. Dr. Mugume, I know this question has come quite a bit to Bank of Uganda on the kind of support it's given to banks as well during this period. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about it.
It is true that the pandemic has affected particular sectors more than the other. For example, I think you saw the quarter GDP released by UBOS towards the end of June. There was a overall contraction of -3.2. Out of that, service sector contracted by 5.2%. That is in the quarter to June. So automatically means that there are individuals or businesses in those particular sectors, the service industry, that are hit and probably may never recover. So the question is where, what can be done or what has been done. So as Bank of Uganda, we thought the best way is, okay, if you are in those affected sectors, service sector, trade, hotels, and you borrowed money from a commercial bank, you don't need to be in a hurry to repay back the money. So you say, okay, let us give you, with a commercial bank, a leeway to service the debt within a period of, say, extending up to, say, 12 months. So to us, that was one aspect of saying, okay, we know you are close, you are not making money, you don't whatever, but in terms of serving your loan, can it be negotiated, can it be rescheduled until you are able to service the loan? We thought that is an important aspect. But you also know that commercial banks are equally affected because they get income from the borrowers. So if I have borrowed and I don't pay and I don't pay the interest and principal, the commercial bank also can easily go under. So we said, okay, commercial bank, we shall also give you a facility. If you are affected because people are not servicing their debts, the borrowers are not paying back interest or principal, we can also extend to you a credit, okay, for a period of, say, 12 months to be able to bridge the gap in terms of liquidity. So in that process, I think we are saying, okay, commercial banks should also not be going under because they are part of the service sector, but also borrowers who have survived can at least schedule their loans and be able to pay loans later on. Another factor, obviously, we have said, okay, the best way is to ease monetary policy. Easing monetary policy means you leave liquidity into circulation more abundantly, so that people are, or the borrowers or lenders are not suffering because of lack of liquidity in the system. So basically, using monetary policy meaning that you leave more money in the circulation, so that commercial banks, are not finding it very expensive to get the liquidity. They can get land on, and also borrowers are not suffering because they can't be able to get liquidity from commercial banks. So those are some of the aspects we have looked at as the Bank of Uganda.
There are quite a number of questions that have already come in for you, Dr. Mugume, in relation to that. And if I get into them, we won't get into the others. So we will come back to this particular conversation. But I'd like to hear you weigh in, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, I think the government has reacted really quickly to the crisis. Has put in a raft of measures, which I think we think are largely suitable. to support the economy, to support the private sector, to support the recovery. I think the critical point right now is where we're at, is the new budget for the next fiscal year.
Yeah.
There's a lot of discussions happening about how to reprioritize, how to reallocate funds to ensure that we're supporting the recovery, that we're maintaining services, particularly the health, the education, services that are important, but that people may cut back on in times of crisis, such as education, sending children to school. So I think now is a very critical time. The next few weeks to see how things pan out.
Absolutely. We heard from the Ministry of Health yesterday or the day before yesterday, and they were, just wondering from the Ministry of Finance if they would be allocated the money that was, left unused from the previous financial year, and it'd be interesting to see what the Ministry of Finance has to say about it. Now, the 15th edition of the Uganda Economic Update, which is being launched today and, which you have just shared with us, Richard, paints an understandably bleak picture of the short-term 1 to 2 year economic prospects. The report casts the economic devastation as worse than the aftermath of World War II. Uganda was not yet born, but Uganda has nevertheless seen total economic devastation with the civil wars of the late 1970s to mid-1980s. The global disruptions have severely and negatively affected key sectors of Uganda's economy. Tourism, trade, remittances, unemployment is on the rise. Poverty rates in the country are projected to grow. Previous government programs will, in all likelihood, have to change to address the new situation. Now, one of the recommendations in the report is reprioritization of government spending. What should be the new priorities in spending? Gentlemen?
Well, I think one has to look at this at where the greatest need is now. And I think that the greatest need probably sits in the health protection space. So I think investment in our health infrastructure is important, not just for this pandemic, but for the future and for a growing youthful population. And to really be able to use this opportunity to find a silver lining out of the pandemic, if you like. Reprioritization to the health sector, I think, is very, very crucial. The other thing is agriculture. I think that the agribusiness is a huge part of what is making us resilient in this time now. So that production can continue, better yields, treating agriculture as a business, larger investment into the sector. Agriculture contributes about 35% to our exports, but currently only takes about 13% of private sector credit. If that can grow and other policy type interventions from government, I think that would be a very, very, very useful thing. So that we have food security in the midst of all the challenges that we have. I think that beyond that, we also have to invest in digital infrastructure because, everybody is talking, it's becoming a cliche now to talk about the new normal. But this is real. Government officials are working from home and, making sure that those critical services can continue is important. You will have seen what's happening with education. While education in its normal form will resume, it is untenable that a child born in Uganda, from this report, their future productivity is relegated to 38% compared to a Kenyan child at 50%. What does that say? The child starts off at a disadvantage. So in this environment, we have to invest in the kind of digital infrastructure that will ensure continuity for education, not just through this period, but beyond. I think that would be extremely useful. In addition to many other things, we must continue the agenda of the other infrastructure that we need to build. But I think focusing on agriculture, health, and building our digital infrastructure now is absolutely critical.
All right. Dr. Mugume, I saw you nod at health. I saw you nod at agriculture. Do we agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Yeah. What other areas should be priority?
I agree with agriculture, I agree with the health of yesterday, and education.
Education.
Yeah, simply because education as a whole, in terms, productivity in Uganda has been declining, not of recent, for a quite number of years, I think. Yeah, it is true. So, and is related to the quality of education. I think the quality of education over the years, Uganda encouraged a number, of universities. We are 20-something universities or secondary schools, but not in terms of enhancing the quality of education. The quality eventually of education feeds into productivity. Okay, so if you can produce a kid who can't do, add or subtract at senior at P7 or P5 or can't read, that automatically means that what do we expect that after P7, if suppose a person is a dropout of P7 but he can't read, so he's as good as a person who never went to school. I think education is important.
And does this education tie into the digital infrastructure
Yeah,
that Matthias
I
was
think
speaking about?
the question is how do you enhance education to incorporate? Digital obviously goes beyond education, but I think we have to use the most, the advancement in technology to cut across all sectors. Education is one of them, health is another aspect, banking, the financial services is another element, government services can be cheaper. Everybody has seen now that you don't need an office space. You can work from home if you have internet. So those are things that we as governments and whatever have to look at. But the most important thing for the case of Uganda, we should never forget about security. It's something that we always take as given because it's a public good. But it's something safety, going home knowing that you can sleep well and you can have a case and go to court. When I'm talking about security, I'm talking about persons and also courts of law, the policing I think is instrumental. And I think everybody knows that probably our policing system is wanting. Everybody agrees that the judicial systems have a question mark, if we are frank. So I think in terms of looking at security, enhancing those sectors, I think also becomes paramount.
I'm very glad you're the one being frank about these things and not myself. So we've pointed out health, agriculture, digital infrastructure, education, and security. Do you want to weigh in on that?
I can just say, yeah, I think another area that comes in the report or recommendation is around social protection, which I did highlight in the presentation. There's clearly a lot of people who are going to fall into poverty. A lot of small businesses have failed, have closed, and I think there needs to be some sort of support there, just to ensure these people don't fall too far back, so that when the recovery comes, when the opportunity comes to pick up their lives, they are able to quickly re-engage and re-establish themselves.
Well, Richard, now that you point out social security, I know that Alana Kembabazi is on the line, and I know that she's listening in. I don't know if we can get Alana. Alana, can you hear me? Alana Kembabazi from Initiative for Social and Economic Rights is really big on social protection. She has done quite a bit of research in this area, and I thought that it would be nice to hear from her on this particular aspect. I also want her to ask a question to the panel that is before us. Alana, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We'd just like to see you now, but please ask. There you go. Please speak to us about social protection. I know you've been listening in, and like I said, I would really like you to ask a question, pose a question to the panel.
Yes, thank you. It's still fascinating discussion. I think this economic update is quite timely. If you recall, the last World Bank economic update that was released in February, the World Bank was recommending that we address social protection to be able to deal with shock. And then COVID really played out. And I think about that, we're laughing a bit about it today because it's something we've been saying for a long time and have not seen traction on. And we are, at the time they were calling for this, our economy was projecting to grow, I think it was like 6.48% or so. And now our economy is falling, and in fact, it's not just the World Bank. Everyone is saying all the progress is made in eradicating poverty the last 10 years or so, then be completely eradicated. And like you pointed out, Josephine, as the report points out, we're going back to like, the economy is shrinking to like the global depression and the Great Depression and going all the way back. It's going to be much worse. And what does it mean? The World Bank has talked about the additional million people that will be in poverty. I think it's easy for us to just look at numbers and look at recently a young man lit himself on fire because he could not pay 40,000 shillings. He chose death over paying 40,000 shillings or being deprived of his border because I'm sure, like so many Ugandans today, he could not face the idea that he would just go home and just be there, right? And we focus on COVID as a health pandemic, and it's not just a health pandemic. It has destroyed lives. And in these moments where people are struggling, so many people are struggling just to survive, just to have the basics. The whole idea is let's look to the state. The state is supposed to cushion us. It's part of the social contract. And in Uganda, we haven't done that, unfortunately, enough. We have given some lip service to it, but we haven't. We have a few social protection programs. We have USAF, the social assistance grants for empowerment for the elderly person, for the older person, which have had a very limited reach only now that they're being nationally rolled out. You know, then there are a few things here and there that they would call social protection, a little bit of public work, but in certain areas. But we just haven't paid enough attention to this. Social protection also requires you, like you all have pointed out, to look at health and to look at education and whether the poor can get them, right? It's not just enough to say we invested in the health sector or invested in the education sector. Are the poor, are those vulnerable who are choosing between food and something else able to access the services? And unfortunately, we just have it. And this economic update here, you're going to focus, as we'll see it, on also on digital inclusion, but we also have to continuously think about who will be left behind. I think that it's a wake-up call. In fact, when I had this question, and I think it was a very good question that you posed, Josephine, when I had you pose it to Bank of Uganda and DFCU, and it's a shame the permanent secretary is not here, and I did not hear social protection come up immediately, I was very disappointed. Because we need to so many Ugandans right now. Before we were saying 1 in 5 Ugandans are poor. Now there's so many, you know, more, and I'm going to think about what the new ratio is going to be like. But just from hearing the report, it's like an additional million or so are extremely vulnerable right now. We need to see the government put money into this, with serious money, and I know that and beyond the World Bank funding, because the World Bank, for example, has given $200 million US. It's going to be shared among different things. Civil society perspective, we still don't know how much is actually going to social protection. The transparency of that is something we really need to flag, but we also need to see it come in the budget processes. Now, during COVID, we've seen the government say it will give out food. It has tried to give out some food. That's not enough. It's talked about, you know, capitalizing UBC and UDB. The question with all these things is, do they reach that person? Do they reach the person who lit himself on fire? And we have to recognize that social protection is not just good policy.
Alana,
it's a human right. It's something we committed
we
to.
Can't hear you very well, Alana. Unfortunately, your signal is breaking really badly. But Alana points out that she was quite disappointed that social protection was not among the first things that was spoken about. Richard, before you speak, I know that one of the questions that she wanted to ask, and she'd sent it to me because we're Ugandans and we don't really trust that the internet will allow us to have these questions uninterrupted. And she wanted to ask, what new social safety nets will government put in place beyond existing public works programs, SAGE, NUSAF, and how much will this go to? Oh, that question is not complete, but what new safety measures will government put in place? Richard, you can start off with your comment.
No, I just had I mean, she touched on a good point there in terms of, she mentioned shocks. And I think I just also want to clarify that the approach we're coming from is not that there needs to be these continual social protection programs necessarily, but that we would like to see a system in place that if there are shocks, there are shock responsive social safety nets, which in this kind of situation can then be time bound, can kick in when there's a shock, kick in when required, and then scale back as things improve.
Yeah. What new safety nets can we start looking at?
Well, I think that first of all, I'd like to thank Alana for her, impassioned presentation on the need for social protection. But we've just seen the data from the report
55% of revenue, generated goes straight to debt service. And that's revenue before we get into, the real tight squeeze of revenue in this year and 2021. So I think there's a limitation on what government can do. But we have to look at the tools which we have available to us. If you just look at the banking sector, for instance, you might not realize, but in a time like this, the banking sector is a shock absorber. From what Dr. Mugume just mentioned, the restructuring, etc., and all of that, allowing some liquidity to remain in the small businesses, not to do repayments. That's shock absorbing in many ways. While in Europe and all these places, checks will come straight to individuals and to businesses. Today, it's your bank that will allow liquidity in your small business, because it will allow you not to repay those facilities. So one of the things that is crucial to kickstart, because if you look at the youthful nature of the population and where people are involved in a lot of informality in business, etc., is just driving up the inclusion agenda in this period. Just trying to see that we go further down the income pyramid to serve a bit more, provide funding and liquidity for people to work themselves out of poverty. And we've seen very fine examples of this working. For instance, the role of what microfinance has been able to do in the recent past, and supporting entities like the Microfinance Support Center, seeing whatever kind of financing is going to come through UDP. How that trickles down through the banking system, I think that would be important for allocation, just like how we saw the agricultural credit facility through Bank of Uganda was allocated very well through the banking system. So I think the banking system has a very big part to play in this period, and I think that most of what will get businesses kick-started, people depend on those small businesses. Most of them don't depend on a formal job or anything. It's a one-person small business. It's a small family business. It's a group-run little business. Just kick-starting that and making resources available at the bottom of the pyramid. That is what ensures sustainability, not providing a meal a day.
Dr. Mugume.
I think I wholly agree in both in the case that, yes, you have to support economic activity, both directly and indirectly, and the government is doing that. The problem with this safety network is that people would think that you just give cash, and as Richard said, it has to, if it has to be done that way, it has to be time bound, say, for a period. Now, is if you have the money, and the question, I agree with Richard in the sense that we need to have, the problem in Uganda, including the household, is that we spend everything, including government, we spend everything to zero. So when you have a shock, then you start saying, I don't have anything. The culture of saying there are bad days that can hit me.
Prepare.
Prepare. That's where you need banking. Okay, in our traditional way, we used to have, I would go to my uncle, I would go to my auntie, and I survive. But those days are dying. So now the question is, you as a household, do you have something that you have put aside? And that's where the rural banking comes in. Have you, if you get, many people say, we are poor, we can't save. I use an example. When I was a kid, I used to have, my mother gave me a box where I would put coins. And when I kept it and I opened it at at the end of the year, I bought myself the first shoe I ever worn. Those are many years ago. So the question is, what have you done in terms of encouraging saving, not waiting for government? What the government has actually done is now looking at circles, not the circle, what the budget called them yoga. And I think in 2020-21 budget, I think they put in around 300 billion. The question is, if you have the youth, if you have women groups, can they form a circle and they get a facility from government? I thought that is one element of really, yes, you are giving them money to do self-activity. Yesterday, I think I saw what Stambik is doing also with UNDP. starting a youth fund, something where they can innovate and get facility from Stanbic and UNDP, to come up with a business that has some bit of innovative, that is innovative. So there are those aspects. The problem I think we have had overall in Uganda is that, we tend to leave those to individuals and households and, to whom it may concern, but not as having a government program basically around that. And I think that's where I agree with Richard that actually, that has to be put into the framework.
All right, our time is quickly spent, but I would like us to just take 2 more questions before we go to some questions from the public. We have also learned during this epidemic how difficult it is to project into the future. Nevertheless, plans have to be drawn for future action based on current projections. The report that you presented, Richard, points to 2 natural hazards that the country experienced shortly before COVID-19, the locust invasion and the floods. The report also notes the upcoming election in 2021. We know how unpredictable and uncertain the times that come with elections can be. Now, with this background in mind, we've lived through locust and the floods, we're living in COVID-19, and we're about to live through an election. What are the top 3 priorities for Uganda over the next 5 years that the public and the private sector in Uganda should focus on?
The priorities?
Yes.
I think we have mentioned...
We're going to use health, education, digital.
Yep.
And we also spoke about security and and agriculture. In
agriculture. Okay. Behind agriculture, obviously, there is an argument that, yes, at the end of the day, you have to industrialize. Once you produce agriculture, once you produce mangoes, once you produce bananas, can you turn them into juice or, sunflower or something?
So basically, we are speaking about industrialization as one of the priorities.
Yep.
Yes, Matthias.
Yeah, but also I think that in addition to all that, I think we need to look at the softer cultural aspects. Yes, we need to step up the level and quality of education to be able to improve,
productivity of our people. But on the other hand, we need to spend. Uganda has been known in the past for being very good at public education. Just sensitization,
just the way you saw about HIV prevention, etc.
Even
COVID-19, even COVID-19, Ebola, etc. We need to take that and use that to drive up domestic savings, and just use that to move beyond the circle to really building domestic savings and people being able to put aside for a rainy day. That will increase liquidity in the system, bring down the cost of funding, really get us to be able to do a lot much more
domestically, but also to be able to channel consumption in the right way, so that the consumption which happens
is developmental, right? So investment in small cottage industries, upscaling small businesses, and aspects along that line.
All right. Well, another thing that came up in the report, Richard, was the issue of oil. And we saw that in the middle of the crisis, the price on oil on the global markets fell almost to 0. This was in part because there was very little movement worldwide. The price has since picked up. Uganda is banking a lot on oil exploration as a future source of revenue. While we have not put all our eggs in one basket, as the saying goes, there is the risk of focusing on this future cash cow and neglecting other critical sectors of the economy. How do we mitigate against this risk? How do we wisely develop this potentially transformational industry and at the same time diversify our economy, more so that we do not become so dependent on oil, which we know in some places is known as a curse? Dr. Mugume?
The oil has remained underground for many years, in part because of what you are raising.
There are questions about if it's still underground.
When it is still underground, we can still talk about it and plan. And actually, if you look at the plan in terms of utilization of oil, if that document was to be followed to the dot, we wouldn't have a problem with oil costs. Simply because you only use oil revenues for infrastructure development and leave the rest for future generation. Now, So if we are only, in simple terms, if we are to use that principle, infrastructure development that enhances productivity and leave the remaining for the future generation, then you wouldn't have a oil curse. Now, that is in writing, signed for. The question is whether politicians can follow that to the dot. So that is why you are still discussing the oil.
Okay. Do you want to weigh in, Marcus?
Yeah, so I think that if you look at it from the current prevailing situation around the global oil industry, with the prices, etc., it does look gloomy. If you look at the investment in renewable energy and the promise of renewable energy, just to give you an example, you know, the other week, last week, Tesla overtook Toyota as the world's most valuable car manufacturer. Something you wouldn't think would happen, but that's because of the innovative nature of the technology and the promise of renewable energy. However, if you look at all of that, you know, over time, in the medium term, you know, prices will come back up when the world gets back to business, etc. So it's good to have the oil and the revenue that will come out of it, and we must conclude the FID and get to production so it comes out of the ground. However, like Dr. Mugume mentioned, it's just discipline. If we have the discipline and and the governance to follow through on what we have planned in those documents, then we will cross the line on the other side, and we will be a very prosperous country.
Richard?
No, I think, I mean, it comes back to your question about the priorities over the next few years in terms of trying to build resilience and safeguard against the future, and not to put too much into oil. And I mean, what I guess we alluded to some of it in the presentation around building human capital. That's critical. Looking at the agriculture sector as a real springboard to this economic transformation and industrialization. I think we've talked about some of the small businesses. There's hundreds and thousands of small businesses out there who provide livelihoods to many, many Ugandans. It's important to ensure that them as a sector are able to grow and develop. And then my fellow panelists here, he mentioned the word governance. I think that's something we haven't mentioned a lot here now. But I'd say that's another critical area that we need to think about to ensure there's stronger governance, stronger institutions. Now in the time of COVID, managing the kind of resources that are coming in, but also going forward in terms of looking towards the future.
Right. Thank you all very much for taking my questions. I'll just pose one question here that's coming for you, Dr. Mugume. And this question says, as central bank, one would imagine that promoting digital economy means reduction in your expenditures on the cost of printing paper money and currency costs, such as transporting money from the various printers. How true is this, and how much in percentage terms do you think the bank can save?
That's a good question, and basically lies on what we are planning to do as the Bank of Uganda. We are trying to say, okay, we spend around $48 million per year in terms of currency, printing and management, including machines. The question is, if you can reduce that benefits to 20 by half by the digitalizing, that would be very good. The problem we have is people still don't trust the digital system. That's why if you send mobile money, people go to cash it out, even under COVID. The question is, we removed everything to do with person to person, whatever, but people still go and cash, simply because they don't trust the digital system.
The money on the phone.
Now what we are trying is, the question goes into public education, awareness, that actually money on your mobile phone is your money. Okay, nobody will see it from you. And I think the national payment bill that has been passed by the parliament will enhance that activity. So it's one of the activities that actually we are going to enhance. We are making sure that actually we make payment system as in real time as possible, minimize handling cash, printing cash, which means that we'll be saving half of what we are spending now, 48 million per year in terms of printing currency.
Do we have a time frame for this?
We are talking about in the question of say 5 years or so,
okay,
to see whether we can gradually enhance that. because it goes, we are dealing with the public, we are dealing with the commercial bank, we are dealing with all financial system, so that actually we go in terms of digital. To automatically also means that probably we don't need all these branches we have. Probably we need to close some of the branches. Since now everything becomes digital, why do you need the brick and mortar branches? Why don't you just turn everything into digital system? I think those are some of the discussions we shall be having as we come up, we really implement the national payment bill.
All right. Yes, Mr. Katamba.
Yeah, maybe just to add on that, I think the banking system and commercial banks have moved significantly over the last few years in terms of investment in technology. If you look at our collective investment in technology to create that transition, particularly to move payments from cash onto digital. I mean, all banks have push and pull on and off the mobile phone from your bank account, in addition to cards and points of sale, terminals across retail institutions, and that sort of thing. All our channels, the key is to optimize our channels and use them for different things. Branches, for instance, need not necessarily be for cash, but there will be a role, supporting small businesses, for offering advice, reaching out to far deeper outposts to deepen the support of the technology of the institutions being used, etc. So I think that over time this transformation will continue to happen. If you look at where we are today compared to 10 years ago in terms of use of digital financial services, I think we've made some significant strides, and as data costs become cheaper, etc., it will become much more palatable as a form. And going back to public education that I mentioned about promoting savings domestically, it should go alongside promoting acceptance of digital money and that sort of thing, so that we bring an overall improvement in the ecosystem.
All right, I'll just take one more question, and it's, what are the low-hanging fruits, immediate benefits to businesses, to the commercial banks, to the tax collector, in adopting digital economy, and how would this, in your view, be affected by ingrained cultures of people who want to touch real money, as you've been saying, Dr. Mugume, and are suspicious of digital payment options? Our very last question, and we can wrap up.
So I think that digitalizing all sorts of services reduces cost in the long run, and it allows, it removes the barrier of huge expensive legacy infrastructure to creating inclusion. So I think for the general public, the investment by banks and fintechs in the technology to digitize financial services does pay off over time. All the public needs to do is to be much more accepting of that, and we've seen it. We've seen a shift in the number of transactions done in the banking hall to transactions done on our online platforms, and that continues consistently. In fact, that shift has been heightened during the lockdown and the pandemic period, because all bank services remained available online. So I think in the long run, there's a benefit for everybody. It's just the public accepting and being much more available to use those services.
Right. Richard, would you like to say something before we close this panel?
No, I just think on that, I think digitalization also just creates a much more even playing field, so that even the smaller players can more easily reach their markets, their customers, which will just, I guess, hopefully in time enhance competition and result in a better product for Ugandans.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to join us for this panel. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get Mr. Hipmo Kanizi, but thank you very much, Alana, for sharing your insights on social protection and joining us for the conversation. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much, Dr. Mugume, and thank you very, very much, Mr. Katamba, for taking the time. Let's take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. And when COVID-19 struck, digital became our solution for socio-economic interaction. We'll switch gears now to the digital economy, which is quite pertinent to the economic outlook that we have been talking about. I'll invite Ms. Kasim, a private sector specialist with the World Bank. Ms. Kursum will present the report on digital economy in the time of crisis.
Thanks, Josephine, and thank you to the panel for a really great discussion just now. I think it's been a great segue into the part that I'll be talking more about, which is Uganda's digital economy, how it compares to peers in the region on some key aspects that we've identified as foundational pieces, and what Uganda can do to sort of, really capitalize on its path to digital transformation, not just to address COVID, but also for medium and long-term growth. As we think about the impact of COVID on Uganda's health sectors, education sector, on private sector firms, we really see that the uptake of digital technologies in mobile money, in sort of online education, in telemedicine and e-health solutions has been sort of a key aspect of the way that individuals and households have, sought to address the impact, and how private sector firms are now thinking about, not just in the banking sector, but also in agribusiness and manufacturing, are thinking about addressing COVID, not during the crisis, but also beyond the crisis. So there are 5 key pillars that I'll talk a little bit more about in this presentation that hopefully we can bring up now and you can all see. One is digital infrastructure. Basically the network coverage, access, affordability of basic digital technologies like mobile phones, like internet, like broadband. The second piece is digital skills, both basic digital literacy and advanced technical skills. The third is digital platforms, both public sector platforms and more on the governance piece, and on citizen services that can be digitized, and private sector platforms. So more sort of the traditional platform economy that's emerged globally, like Uber and Airbnb, and how that kind of applies to Uganda as well. The fourth is digital entrepreneurship. And the fifth are digital financial services, the most ubiquitous of which, of course, is mobile money and digital payments. So the good part is that we have a lot of global data that supports the kind of positive impact of digital technologies. We know there's an increase in GDP per capita, in economy-wide productivity, and in female labor force participation as digital technologies are adopted more widely in a particular country. In Uganda, however, next slide please, we see that there's a particular challenge, because even though Uganda has been improving for the past several years in adoption of digital technologies, it's still not doing as well as other countries in the region. In Uganda, a mobile phone coverage is less than 70%. In Kenya, it's more than 95%. In Nigeria, it's 88%. In Rwanda, it's 79%. And even within the country, we see that there are geographical differences in network access and network coverage. In urban areas, 70% people have mobile phones. In rural areas, 46% people have mobile phones. Similarly for internet as well, urban citizens have 25% internet access. In rural areas, it's only 5%. So this is a very sort of concerning statistic, because what we need to make sure is that there's kind of universal access or equal access to digital technologies that can enable all citizens and all individuals and households and firms, both in the formal and the informal sectors, to really leverage these technologies appropriately. Another key piece here that's very relevant to Uganda is that women are less likely to own mobile phones. We were talking just now about sort of female groups organizing into SACCOs and other sort of productive enterprises, and access to enabling digital technologies is a very big piece of that. Women in Uganda, only 46% of female adults have access to mobile phones, compared to 58% of male adults. So again, there's a gap in access here that kind of cuts across several key population segments. In terms of affordability as well, there's a bit of a challenge here in Uganda. In absolute terms, the price of 1 gigabyte of mobile data is $4, which is actually a lower price than they have in Kenya, But when you look at it in terms of the share that this price takes up in terms of national income per capita, it's nearly 8% of per capita income. Compared to 2% of per capita income in Kenya and 5% of per capita income in Nigeria. So clearly, just this sort of very basic mobile data is much more expensive in Uganda for an average citizen than it is for their peers in other countries in the region. There are several reasons that go into this, and sort of the report, goes into a little more detail on this. But some of the reasons here are the high costs of devices that are also subject to import taxes. There's a high cost of just accessing basic digital services in terms of cost of bandwidth. For network operators, there's the cost of licensing and spectrum fees. At the same time, there's some new taxation that's been introduced as well. So there's a social media tax of 200 shillings a day. There is a tax on withdrawals of mobile money, which also sort of impacts the uptake and the usage and how frequently people can use these services and how frequently they can afford to use these services. Now that's, all of that being said, we really do need to remember that it's been an improvement over the past several years. And despite all of these challenges, digital technologies do have a huge role to play in COVID response and economic recovery in Uganda. In terms of health, just to sort of think about some of the digital solutions that are already present in the Ugandan market. The private sector has already sort of tested in the market and are using here. There's a range. There's sort of portable diagnostics that TEHECA is doing. There are clinical and records management solutions that can really make it more efficient to manage pharmaceutical inventory, to manage supply chains, to make sure that essential medications are sort of being managed appropriately and that they're being supplied to the communities where they're most needed. At the same time, we've seen globally that there's been an expansion of a kind of usage of mobile network operators' data, of telcos' data to assist in disease monitoring and disease surveillance, to really preempt outbreaks and to sort of be able to focus resources that the government is already providing for crisis response more appropriately. At the same time, an expansion in telemedicine and e-health means that the hospital systems and the health systems are not overburdened. So if you can have interactions with doctors online, that kind of reduces the need for people to come into hospitals and clinics. At the same time, big data is being used globally to manage the global response by WHO and by other kind of organizations. Again, this response goes beyond COVID, and the panel talked about this earlier as well, right? That COVID is the crisis right now, but we know from history that there are many other potential health crises that might be coming our way. The preparation and the investments that we make right now in testing these solutions in the Ugandan market and scaling up these solutions will really be helpful in the future as well. For the private sector, the key is really to kind of maintain access to basic financial services, online banking, digital banking, mobile money. These are absolutely essential. These do count as essential services. And we're seeing that there has been an uptick in the usage of these services, pending, of course, the constraints that I've already talked about, the constraints in urban versus rural, the constraints in men versus women. Again, for the private sector as well, what they need to think about is how do they invest in sort of building resilience at the firm level. So what can help firms survive the crisis and then recover after the crisis? A couple of examples of this is sort of the growth in online shopping and e-commerce. The more small businesses, the more informal businesses can tap into these platforms, and it's sort of the entry barriers can be low, right? If you have a basic level of digital literacy, you can sign up to a platform and start supplying your goods and services to consumers over the platform. For agribusiness firms, for manufacturing firms, it's really important to start thinking about how they're going to digitize their supply chains, how they're going to manage their logistics better, how they're going to train their workers to sort of use these digital solutions more effectively going forward. And this again has a huge impact on productivity, which has already been identified as a challenge for Ugandan firms. At the same time, things like smart manufacturing, the adoption of those is very, very low in the Ugandan economy. This is the perfect time for firms with sort of support to invest in these solutions, to test these solutions now and to scale them up as they go forward. Social protection, we've talked a lot about as well. Here, as we scale up digital authentication, mobile ID solutions, digital social protection payments, it's going to sort of make for more effective targeting. So you're making sure that the resources that the government is allocating to this response are going to the people at the communities where they're most needed. Now, next slide, please. As we talk about all of these solutions, the big piece, of course, is that we need a much, much stronger regulatory environment to enable these solutions, to even enable the private sector to be able to develop these solutions and scale up these solutions. The National Payments Bill has just been passed by Parliament in May 2020. It's waiting assent. But we're still waiting also on the implementation timeline and the action plan for how exactly this bill will be implemented, who's going to be involved, and how that's going to be sort of scaled up. The 2018 Data Protection and Privacy Act also has not been fully implemented. It's been 2 years now, but the Data Privacy Office is yet to be established. The regulations to make the law effective are still pending. One of the other pieces as well is digital consumer credit. So individual loans that people are taking online are not yet regulated or not covered by the Bank of Uganda's existing financial consumer protection guidelines. And this, of course, makes it harder for consumers to be fully informed, to be protected, and to really sort of take on credit more responsibly. These are just some of the pieces that talk to the broader regulatory environment for the digital economy, for digital financial services in Uganda. We've already talked about kind of the big affordability challenge, and we've talked about how digital payments have actually been rising, and Uganda is doing quite well on this. We see that the proportion of people using digital payment services is pretty high in urban areas. It's pretty good for kind of male users. But again, the rural and the female segments are not using them to the extent that they could be, and especially when you compare with the region. A big piece of this is that people are reluctant to adopt these digital services as well. And that comes under the market development piece. Now, market development, of course, is impacted by the fact that mobile money withdrawals are taxed, unlike your in-person withdrawals or your cash withdrawals. That the fact that the social media tax, which often as people start using social media, you see that they start using other digital services as well. Small entrepreneurs that use social media to access markets, to access consumers, to really sort of grow their businesses as well. And that tax sort of, the fear is that tax is kind of constraining that growth, which is not particularly relevant as we're looking to support small businesses, as we're looking to support sort of the more digitization of more traditional businesses. And, one thing to note here is that the social media tax is actually not performing as well either, according to the URA. They, and they talk about this in their report as well, that that particular tax has actually been underperforming as well. So it's also not meeting its domestic resource mobilization or taxation targets. So that's something that we encourage sort of a review of, a consideration of, especially in the context of the market development that we need, especially in the context of the fact that we need more people to use these digital services. To build a bigger market for the private sector, but also to make things easier for consumers and to give them a wider choice of products and services. And beyond sort of some of these regulatory pieces as well, we see that the ecosystem, the sort of broader environment for digital enterprises is growing. It's very dynamic in Uganda. It's nascent. It's sort of still at an early stage of development, but there's a lot of activity. There are a lot of hubs, a lot of them in Kampala, but also kind of expanding beyond, that are providing very key services to startups, from supporting viable ideas to helping them kind of access initial donor funding, from helping them access legal services, and really providing a connection for digital startups and a home for digital startups where young entrepreneurs, where dynamic entrepreneurs can get together and really sort of learn from each other and learn from experts as well. Again, we see that Uganda is actually emerging as quite a popular destination for private equity and venture capital deals in the technology and telecom sector as well, which is a very, very positive sign, and which kind of makes us think, or it should make us think, that if an early stage ecosystem can attract such viable deals, think about what's going to happen once the Ugandan ecosystem really takes off. And the way that it can take off is by taking more of an ecosystem-wide approach to development of the digital economy, to really sort of encouraging private sector businesses in agribusiness and manufacturing, which are sort of the more traditional business models, to digitize their business models, to purchase local domestic solutions, and to really sort of invest now, especially under COVID, but also going beyond, investing in sort of using digital solutions and leveraging digital solutions. Similarly for the e-commerce sector, which is underdeveloped in Uganda, only 23% of internet users shop online, and that's actually quite comparable to other countries in the region as well.
I know it's quite an elaborate presentation and it could go on for quite a bit, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of time. Is there any final thing you must say?
Yeah, let me just make one big point later then, what all of this builds up to is both developing Uganda's domestic digital market, but also giving Ugandan businesses access to the regional digital market. There's 200 million people in the region, investing in the development of a single digital market. Just for Ugandan consumers will yield about $632 million in consumer benefits, just with lowered prices of broadband internet. So that's clearly an investment worth making as well. The key message here is really that the ecosystem is dynamic, and there are some key pieces that need to be put into place to really sort of capitalize on Uganda's strengths.
All right. Thank you very much, Kursum. I'm hoping you're going to stay online so you can join in the panel discussion for some questions that might come out for you. Thank you so much for that presentation. I'll very quickly introduce the panel that will be sharing insights on that front. I'll start with Ms. Vivian Dambia, the Director, Technical Services, NITA Uganda. She is responsible for providing technical support and guidance on all matters related to ICT infrastructure systems and services within government. Thank you so much for joining us, Vivian. All right, I'll go to Ms. Jackie Ochola, who is a Ugandan tech enthusiast and business leader. She has worked in the tech industry as an engineer, manager, and business leader for companies like Andela, Nokia, Alcatel, Lucent, and Uganda Telecom in Uganda, Kenya, and DR Congo and Nigeria. She's currently a member of the Uganda National Task Force on Emerging 4IR Technologies. Thank you very much for joining us, Jackie.
Hello, hi, thank you.
And finally, Michael. We intentionally insisted that you sit there so that we wouldn't feel as though the other gender wasn't represented. Thank you so much for joining us. Michael is the Program Director, Refactory at Clark International University. He's also the ICDL Africa Country Manager for Uganda. He's a member of the Advisory Group for the Government of Uganda on the 4th Industrial Revolution Technologies. He is a member of several technology innovation review panels, both locally and internationally, and served on the ICT Technical Working Group of the Presidential Investor Roundtable. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, thank you.
All right, well, we're going to quickly get into our questions. The digital economy is projected to account for about 25% of global GDP in the next 5 years, according to the report that Kursum has just shared with us. It is an economic revolution unfolding before our eyes. And yet, looking at the state of Uganda's digital activity, this revolution could easily pass us by. Our digital infrastructure is still poor, even in comparison to other East African countries. Many do not have access to digital services. Our digital skill levels are comparably low. How can Uganda have a piece of this lucrative digital pie, if at all we can? Please feel free to start.
I'll go first. Digital infrastructure is what I do, so I should start. We've done quite a lot on the infrastructure front in Uganda. But there is still quite a lot more that can be done and could be done. From the beginning, communication infrastructure was looked at majorly as something that should be done by the private sector. Over the years, we've realized that that might not be, because then it will not be equitable or affordable. So as a government, we've also now gotten into the space of building communications infrastructure, which will then be given out to the private sector to use, which will enable us to have equitable spread and also lower the costs. Communication infrastructure should also be looked at like a utility. It's like electricity, it's like roads. And if we don't do that, it will take us some years to actually cover the whole country. That notwithstanding, we've gone some strides into doing this. But the current crisis has shown how badly we're doing. Somebody having a Zoom meeting. Yeah, we've all gone through this, and we realize that quite a lot has to be done, and it's got to be done quickly.
I'm curious as to what the obstacles are. I hate to compare our neighbors, with us. I should be able to, but I don't want to do it. What is our problem?
Some of our problems, one, lie in funding. The second one also lies in understanding what we need to do. If we could all focus and realize that this infrastructure is needed, and it is going, there's a study that was done by the Columbia University that says that for every 10% increase in broadband penetration, we have a 0.5% increase in GDP. So if we come from that angle of realizing that this is actually going to help our economy grow, more so in this situation which we are in today, where we are seeing that we've got to revive our economy. We've got to invest a lot more into the communications infrastructure. She has talked about women, there are more women online than there are men, which is quite surprising. Usually it's the other way around. Somebody will tell you that we are more or less gossiping instead of doing anything. But in actual sense is that there are more female entrepreneurs, and they are online. But they are hampered by costs. They are hampered by access. They are hampered by knowledge of how to go about using the digital space. And
we also know they are hampered by the abuse that is online.
The cyberbullying that is going on. And we are also hampered by a lack of awareness of security platforms, of what should we do to keep ourselves secure online. So just to wrap it up, it is very, very important for us to actually grow our infrastructure. We have plans as government, as NITA. We currently have about 4,000 kilometers of fiber spread across the country. Fiber optic cable is used to transmit voice and data. And we have a plan of going to every sub-county. So if we can get to every sub-county, that enables the telecom companies to actually easily spread out to the villages and homes.
Do we have timeframes that we're looking at to achieving anything of the things that we are speaking about? Right now, companies are speaking about people should work from home. How are we going to do that if you can't have a conversation without the interruptions and the freezes and all of that?
Timeframes are usually determined by availability of budgets. But as you've heard, the last panel was talking about, even the report today has talked about reorganizing our budgets to focus on digital infrastructure. So we are hopeful that this is going to come a lot sooner.
All right. Michael, would you like to weigh in?
I think I would say copy and paste, the bigger part of it. I think for me, at a higher level, digital needs to be seen as a factor of production. Like we see land, water, and all the other factors of production that we learned in economics. So if you start seeing it at that level, then your perception, your taxation regime, and everything that comes with it tends to change. The way we sent a number of people to go and study the oil and gas is the same way we should be looking at how do we equip our Ugandans to have the digital skills, competence to be able to drive us to the digital economy that we desire. And like you were saying, our neighbors. So that needs to really be seen in that perspective, because the unfortunate bit is that we sometimes get the sense that ICT, to a large extent, in the government documents is said to be one of the economic drivers, but in terms of investment from government, you see the opposite. It's like we're at the bottom. So I hear Vivian, I hear her frustration, and I think she has. I mean, if you look at the roadmaps that NITA has, there are times I used to joke with Vivian and her colleagues, I say, when shall we ever drive on these roads? But it's the frustration that funding is not coming through. And my last point is that we need to look at it from a holistic perspective, what I would call the ecosystem. So look at the players, look at the enablers, and look at the supply side, as well as the demand side. These must be seen in totality. You can't just focus on one and you think you'll get it.
All right, Jackie, very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly, I would agree that number one is reprioritizing at the highest levels, ICT as a sector. But then also speaking from the private sector, I would say that the whole question of affordability comes up, and you have to ask yourself, why is the cost of broadband internet in Uganda much higher than in the neighboring countries? In the report, Kusam has shared that taxation is an issue, but then we have to look at other components. If a private company is building broadband infrastructure, what kind of costs are they meeting? Is there a way to bring those down? For example, the right of passage, if you're going to lay optic fiber across the city, and the city council is charging you exorbitantly, we have to step back and think, is it possible for the taxing bodies, for the bodies that charge service rates, to reconsider the approach to taxation? At what point do you tax, do you charge? Is it at the point when you see an opportunity that can be explored, or do you tax and charge after the opportunity has been realized and is bringing benefit?
Well, Jackie, you're preempting my next question. In addition to the inadequate infrastructure and skills, taxation of digital services, social media, and mobile money, which is really the cry online, as we'll see, was cited in the report as suppression of growth of digital services. How could government policy propel growth of the digital economy rather than suppress it? Because that's what it looks like it is.
There are a number of things that affect, like she talked about, there are a number of things that affect affordability. One of them is the access side, and that's what we were talking about, the input side, the infrastructure. But there is also the access side. So if you find that there are just 27 million, and those are just the mobile subscriptions, we're not yet talking about internet subscriptions, those are way below. If a telecom company has to recoup their investment, they're going to charge a bit higher because the number of people accessing is small. So there are a number of things that affect that. Access to devices, and it also goes back to at what cost do we get the devices, and taxation plays quite a big role in that. But also, what are the services out there for the citizens to access? What does my mother need internet for? So if there is something that is compelling for her to get online, then she will definitely try to find a mobile phone and she will get online. And the numbers the volume, the bigger the volume, the lower the costs. So there are a number of things we are doing as government to enable that to happen. You've heard about the plant that was opened that is, has started by assembling phones, but we are also going into manufacturing that will help us to cut down on the cost of smart devices coming through. We are also looking at taking government services online. If we take government services online, it will compel the citizens to actually get online, and therefore the numbers will grow, the price will go down. It's a chicken and egg situation. What comes first? So there are policies that need to be in place. There is security that needs to be looked at, because some people will not go online because they are scared. The panelists before said some people will go and withdraw their mobile money because they are worried that it is not safe wherever it is. So there is a lot of awareness that needs to be done. There is a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in place to ensure security. So those are all things that are being done.
I'm really hoping you're going to speak about the taxes.
Okay, on the taxes issue, government needs money, that's for sure. But like she said, when do you tax? Do you tax at the beginning of an opportunity, or do you tax at the end? And we've seen that from the numbers coming out of OTT, that it has not yielded that much money. So most probably, maybe we might want to scrap that and tax at the end of the service. So we tax the other service and consider this as an enabler.
Most probably, maybe.
Yes, it is a case of most probably, maybe.
All right. So we know that the crisis that we've found ourselves in forced increased use of digital services like Zoom, like you were saying earlier, for business and family meetings. And since we would not physically interact with friends, we resorted to social media even more than usual. Digital tech also plays a critical role in data collection, which is critical for a fast-spreading viral disease like COVID-19. What are the other opportunities for digital tech in the health sector? You heard from the panel before that health was an area that they thought should be given priority. Michael, I will start with you.
I think there is no doubt about the role that technology can play in the delivery of health services. But I guess it's the challenge is the execution. The progression from we know to doing. There are thousands or hundreds of people who have built applications in this economy or in this ecosystem that are health related. But is it to progress it from an app that is sitting in a hub to a solution that is used at a national level is a different ballgame. And the resources required, not many people will afford. So that's why you find most of our innovators are hopping from one challenge to another, hoping they can get money and then they can scale. Number two is at a national level we need direction. Direction in a sense that where do we want to see health, for example, and what do we want to see technology play? What role we want to see technology play? Then we can make the investment. Then we can innovate. What we see is I wake up in the morning and I think we can have an app that will test for malaria. Boom. You get the media publicity. You feel like you've conquered the world. But to move it from that idea to having it into the hospital is a lot more than what it is. So we need a concerted effort, if I could put it that way. Concerted in the sense that we need direction from where is government thought process. What are they thinking about? Where do they want to invest? And once we have that direction, then the resources, the people, the private sector then fall in line. If it is left to a game of chance, let me try, who do you know in Ministry of Health? You go and present, you're given a chance, or the next time you'll hear somebody has come and presented this. It becomes very difficult for us then to actually realize the benefits that technology can bring to this ecosystem.
Does this cut across as well to other sectors like agriculture and financial services?
I would say yes, it does, because even if you're to look at the agriculture sector, you have the e-voucher that is probably giving you access to seeds and 1, 2, 3 things. But then if my mother wants to auction her maize on the platform, that is not possible. She still depends on the middleman. So where is the thought process at the agricultural level, guided by the National IT Authority? Because one of the things, and I'll be very honest with you, you have technocrats like NITA, who will probably be brought in at the end because of, and yeah, the way we work in Uganda is people have territories, and they are guarded territories. Let's be very honest about it. They are guarded territories. So if NITA comes in, NITA is encroaching on someone's territory. And that's one of the challenges that we need to open up and say, how do we work together? How do I see NITA as an enabler to deliver better services? So the silos have to break if we are going to see the dividends out of this.
All right. Jackie, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, what I wanted to say was, just like you said, Josephine, this crisis actually presents an opportunity for technology to play a real part in addressing many of the problems across sectors, really. And I'll speak from a technology standpoint. In health, for example, we talk a lot about contact tracing, and I'd like to believe today the way it's being done is write your phone number and your name, your village, and then you'll get a phone call.
Vivian says no.
No? All right. But it's something that if done digitally would be a lot more effective and efficient, and information coming out of the data that is being captured and processed is then able to inform the rest of the population in real time. You then fight things like stigma, because why is there stigma? It's out of fear, and fear is largely driven by a lack of information. The more information people have, the more comfortable they are in facing whatever conditions come to you, rather than sit back and say, oh, COVID is going to kill us. No, you know that these are the symptoms, look out for them. If this happens, do this. In any case, your chances of survival are very high. You will live to see another day. In terms of distribution of personal protective equipment, in terms of distribution of drugs, you have all sorts of technology like blockchain, which is really built for spreading information so that it's available to all people at all times, and you're then knowledgeable about where you can find what in what time. And so, to me, really, the technologies have already been developed. The opportunity is here and now, and we will only thrive through this if we can then adapt to using them quite fast.
All right. One of the key things that the previous panel spoke about on the economy was education. And we're also looking at how do we then digitize education. And we have a question from Yasmin Mayanja, who says, joined late and network is terrible. I would like to know if there are any plans for supporting national schools' e-learning programs. Will it be discussed? Please summarize for us on this issue.
There are plans for e-learning. Some of them, they've started with institutions of higher learning. Some guidelines have been put in place. We still have some work to do on that. As we move down to the lower classes, the best situation would be that we have a laptop per child. And it is possible. No, just don't laugh. It is.
I'm smiling. It's a very nice thing to think about, because you think about laptop per child and you look at the our conditions in the country. When you think about laptop for a child, you think about Kampala, really, and maybe you think about particular places. You're not thinking about the rural.
It's even doable for the rural situations. You're going to tell me that there are blockers like power. How will they charge? We can have solar units installed in different areas where they can actually walk to and charge this. It is doable, it is possible. We just need to focus all our energies on actually doing that. So if we can have that, you actually have those solar units, they're the same units that can be providing content, and therefore the child comes to charge and also is able to pick up the content to take back home. So it's not an out of this world dream. it is something that is actually physically possible to do within our current context.
I think that a question that even before I check social media that's going to come up is, if we've not yet received the radios and the masks, how are we going to receive the laptops?
Yes, I can understand where that would come from. But like I said, it takes a concerted effort. And it takes, like he talked about, it takes breaking up of the different silos to enable everybody to work together towards this.
Yeah.
And if we don't do that, we are going to continue to lag behind. They've told us that productivity of a Ugandan child will be at 36%. If you measure it with our neighbors, that is really, really way, way below. And it is becoming a global economy, so how will our children compete on the global economy? If we can't do this, that percentage is actually going to go lower. So we need to focus on that.
Michael?
Education is close because this is the space that I'm operating in. I have said it, that we probably are going to miss an opportunity to innovate. We are waiting for the paperwork to be correct, the T's to be crossed, the I's to be dotted, for the policy to read right, then you can start. If I was the other side, I'll probably say, start. Let's learn from those that have taken the initiative to start. Because that's really, in IT, we talk about agility. You start, learn from those guys, correct, and as you correct, you begin to see a lot of opportunities. And I'm speaking from a point of practice, because at Refactory, we realized that schools are not going to open soon. So we said, let's go online.
We seem to be working with the policy of leave no one behind.
Yes, there is that leave no one behind, but let's be very honest. Even when you have universal primary education, is every child in school?
I don't know why you're looking at me very
I'm just asking because you see, I like the whole good feel of leave no one behind. But you see, when you're dealing with crises like this, you have an opportunity to innovate and go into areas you probably have never thought about. And I can tell you, when we decided to take our program online, we had 30 students who had been admitted. Out of the 30, we have one guy who is in Kabale, and he has attended all the sessions online. Now, we thought it is not possible.
Vivian said because he's?
No, because there is fiber in Kabale.
Okay. And truth be told, I think from a coverage perspective, you will get very stable to medium stable, but you easily get access to the internet. Now, what are we saying is that we have learned quite a lot in the 1.5 months when we've run our program online. There are a lot of things we hadn't thought about, but if we had waited for every paper, every T to be crossed, we probably wouldn't have started. So what am I saying? I think education needs to create an opportunity for those that are stepping forward and give them the space to say, okay, lead us, show us what are you learning. And as they do that, we correct. And the others that will come on board will probably have a better way to start. And probably things like tabs, without thinking about, let's say, the laptop, could be cheaper than a laptop and easier to access. And we will have modified a couple of things. So I think there is an opportunity, but there's also a likelihood that we'll miss the opportunity in a lot of analysis.
Because we're waiting for everybody.
Well, I'll agree. I'm waiting for everyone.
Jackie, do you want to say something?
Just something brief.
And while you're saying that,
yes,
in your closing remarks, because these will be closing remarks, what do we need to do on the regulatory front?
First, on the point Michael just made about not leaving anyone behind, I actually believe in different solutions, different target groups at different times. Yes. Integrate all of them, and I think we've seen that work in the financial services sector. Yeah. You can transact on your mobile via SMS. You can go online. You can call. You can, for ATMs, some ATMs for certain banks, you can be sent money that you withdraw, even if you don't have a bank account with that. So different solutions, different communities. So just like you said, the urban areas that are ready for the tablets with power, let's start off there. Where we are not quite ready, we start with an intermediate solution rather than wait for one solution fits all. That is what the comment I wanted to make on that. And then on closing, on the regulatory front, I would say that to enable a digital economy, there is a need for digital transactions regulations to be put in place. And like everybody says, security is always going to be something of concern. And so, yes, we have a Data Privacy and Protection Act and all, but thus far, in the technical side, we see that regulation lags behind innovation. And so the more we close that gap, or like Michael says, keep iterating. If we thought this is where the world was going 6 months ago, things move so fast, we need to move our regulations that fast, or a little faster than they are today.
All right, and you spoke about digital security, and I've seen all of us in trying to use all these applications, these online meetings recently. You have a lot of people jumping into your meeting and, you know, doing all kinds of antics. Michael, in closing, do you want to speak to that and also speak about the regulation?
Yes, it goes back to literacy, because tools like Zoom and all these have settings that many of us never go to. Are you on Zoom? No. What do I need? www.zoom.us, your own. You start firing. You don't go to your settings to check what do I need to activate, what do I need to deactivate. It goes to literacy. So digital literacy should be a national concern. And we should get as many of our citizens educated and empowered to use technology. Regulation will always come after technology, because you probably want to make it broad. I'll give an example of the Computer Misuse Act. And the way it is, your phone is a computer. So you cannot say, I didn't use a laptop. Your phone is taken care of. So you need to think from a regulator's perspective, not to stifle because you don't know what is coming, but you also want to create a framework within which the operations are running. So I would say invest in digital literacy and get as many Ugandans as possible digitally skilled.
All right, thank you, Michael. Vivian.
On the laws, most of the digital laws actually sit with NITA. We have the Electronic Signatures Act, the Electronic Transactions Act, Computer Misuse Act, now the Data Protection and Privacy Act, and the NITA-U Act itself. Most of these laws are available, and we've been doing quite a concerted effort in creating awareness about these laws. For example, electronic transactions. Do you know whether if you've clicked submit or pay, what does that mean? Can you return? Can you uncommit? What certain criteria of products are allowed to be committed? So there have been quite a lot of awareness going on, but we could do better. And we are working on that to try and do better. We had, I think the last month, we had an awareness month for the laws. But we're doing this online and possibly not reaching as many people as we should. So we are working on, we have a whole program that we've embarked on, that is going to do an awareness on information security and awareness on the laws, so that we can encourage people to actually embrace online services.
Thank you very much, Vivian. I would like Kursum, if you can hear me, to I'm sure you are listening into our conversation. If you'd like to share with us what your thoughts are on regulation and any other thing that you picked up on from the conversation that you think is important for us to take out of it.
Absolutely. I think the panels really sort of hit all the right points here, right? It's really important to invest in skills development, both at the basic digital literacy level so that people are more willing to adopt digital products and services, but also the more advanced technical skills so that the needs of the private sector as it grows can be met through local talent, and we can diversify sources of talent within Uganda as well. That's one big piece of it. Another big piece of it is, as we're expanding the physical infrastructure, what are we doing to really make sure that rural segments are adopting these technologies, that they're able to access these technologies, that women are able to access these technologies, and that they have the knowledge and the information and the comfort of data protection and privacy to really scale up use, right? So it's not just enough to be a consumer of social media. You can also, Instagram, for example, has more than 400,000 people in Uganda. A lot of them can be micro entrepreneurs, can be self-employed, who can use that platform better and more productively to actually reach consumers and to reach bigger markets. On the regulatory piece, there's a big role for government and market development and making sure that investors want to come into Uganda, that they want to invest in Ugandan digital enterprises, that local investors have the opportunities to invest in digital enterprises, and that people feel comfortable and secure enough, that consumers feel that there's a consumer protection framework that protects them when they're conducting online transactions. And again, that they have the information and the knowledge to use these products and services well. Uganda's been doing well. We can do better, and hopefully, this report kind of provides the framework for that dialogue to advance further.
Thank you very much, Kusum. Thank you to our panel as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to share those insights with us. I want to now hand over to Mr. Tony Thompson once again to launch the report. But before I do, I'll just point out a couple of questions that came out and they're to the World Bank. Hopefully, Tony can respond to them in closing. One was from David Tumwesje, who says, to what extent is the World Bank Uganda office supporting government to mitigate the potential rise in poverty and inequality as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? Another question is, the report highlights a growth in debt and cost of debt servicing in coming years. What can we do to halt this trend? And the final question, to what extent is the World Bank Uganda office? Oh, that was already spoken about. Thank you so much. Tony, I hand over to you. Hopefully you respond to this before you then launch the report.
For raising those questions. We've been following all the comments, following the discussion very, very closely, and it's been going very well. So let me try to respond to those three questions that you raised. Let me start with the debt question. So we do highlight the concerns with the debt in the report. Really, how do you manage that? We would say that it's very important for government when it's looking at public investments to focus on three things. First is to make sure that they're investing in the best projects, the ones that are going to give the biggest contribution to the country. Secondly is that they get those projects at the best price. Usually that means using competitive procurement and not going with single source procurement. And third is always to look for the best possible financing, the lowest cost. And usually that means making sure you're maximizing your access to concessional financing and grants as much as possible. I don't think those three things have always been optimized in the past. There's an opportunity to do that, and especially with the fiscal strains that are going to come up in the next few years, then it's really going to be a question of prioritize. There's a question then about what the Uganda Office of World Bank is doing to support government to mitigate the potential rise in poverty. So we're working very closely. We've already, I think, taken a record number of new operations to the board, many of them financed by grants. We're continuing to do that through the rest of the year. That includes things like emergency financing for the health response, providing funds that can be used for the laboratory testing supplies, for protective equipment, for health workers, and also for the actual tests themselves. You'll have seen we recently provided $300 million of budget support, and we had very intense discussions with the government on a number of things, particularly on the social protection agenda, which is very important to us. Alena raised a number of really important points. We're supporting a number of measures like the NUSAF, like the labour-intensive public works, but in fact we do believe that more can be done. That is an ongoing conversation that we're having with government. We are taking note very much of the priorities that were flagged by the participants today. Many of those areas are areas that we're working. But we do take note of the priorities, and we do expect to be in discussion with our government counterparts and with other stakeholders on how we can constructively support the country as it does its best to recover from the hit that it has taken. On digital, then final point on the digital, then we already have a very strong, productive partnership with NIDA-U and with other parts of the government, and in fact we're planning to scale that partnership up and put more resources in later on this year. So we're doing a lot of work, and I think that this conversation today has been very helpful. So Josephine, let me give a big thanks to you for doing such a superb job of moderating this rather complicated discussion over the past 2 hours. Let me thank our panelists. They've done a superb job of engaging on the subject, coming in open-minded, putting great ideas on the table. So that's been very helpful as well. Thank you to all of the people who have participated online. It's been difficult to follow, a challenge to follow with YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and the TV program itself, but all of that's good. And I really want to thank, special thanks to NTV for pulling it all together and for making it possible. So as I said before, I'm the country manager for the World Bank. I live here in Kampala. We have our office in Kampala. We work very closely with our counterparts here in Uganda, and we're standing with the people of Uganda and working with you through this crisis together. We want to make sure that Uganda is getting the maximum benefit from its membership of the World Bank Group. So thank you very much for today. It's been a pleasure to be online, and hopefully we can do this again sometime. Thanks.
Tony, and thank you to all the panelists from the previous discussion, this particular discussion, Richard, who is still with us, Lana, who joined us at a point, Kursum, and everybody that has participated online. We thank you for your contributions. And well, I think that brings us to the end of this. Thank you once again.
Thank you.